Hello. We resume our discussion of the American presidency. Uh, as you know, we're nearing the end of our lecture sessions on the American presidency. The topic for today is the president's relationship with the bureaucracy. We will start this session by talking about the presidential roles rooted in the Constitution and law with respect to the bureaucracy. Following that, we will talk about the president's mechanisms for controlling the bureaucracy, the tools of control by the president of the bureaucracy. Following that, we will talk about regulation. Regulation is one of the most controversial aspects of the president's relationship with the bureaucracy. And then we will conclude with a sort of a theoretical overview of the research questions that are prevalent in the literature on presidents and the bureaucracy. Whether you know it or not, the field of public administration is devoted specifically to the study of bureaucracy, both at the federal, state, and local level, and maybe even you could extend that into the corporate realm with schools of public service. In any case, this is a very important field in political science and in public administration schools. And so we will go ahead and share the screen and begin talking about the relationship between the president and the bureaucracy. Okay, so as you can see, the topic for today's discussion is, as I just stated, the president and the bureaucracy. Presidents perform certain roles with regard to their relationship with the bureaucracy. The Constitution invests the president with the responsibility to, and I quote from the Constitution, take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Implicitly, this is a major responsibility of the president. However, as the office has evolved over time, the administrative role of the president has taken a back seat to the other roles. These other roles include the president as chief foreign policy initiator and chief legislator. Of course, it wasn't always so. During the 19th century and through most of the 20th century, the president was relegated to the role of simply faithfully executing the laws. And presidents didn't get much involved in the legislative process, and America did not have much in the way of a foreign policy. And so this is a relatively new idea that presidents don't get very much involved in the administrative role of the president. Policy administration includes implementing the big variety of official government policies, both foreign and domestic. This means that the president issues directives to the bureaucracy, is responsible for dispersing funds, making loans, awarding grants, disseminating information, analyzing problems, signing contracts, hiring and assigning personnel, creating organization units, proposing alternatives, planning for the future, negotiating. The list goes on and on of things that the president is responsible for doing. These can be summarized through the acronym that is commonly used in the field of public administration. The acronym is POSDCORB: planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. These are the main tasks of public administrators. There are obstacles to effective implementation. These obstacles to effective implementation include poor communications, inadequate resources, implementers' dispositions, bureaucratic structure, and executive follow-up. The president is in charge of an executive branch that is responsible for a plethora of programs. As you've seen already, from the organization of the executive branch. As you looked at it earlier, you saw that the executive branch is quite complex, consisting of departments, sub-departments, independent agencies, corporate entities, and so forth. There are literally hundreds of programs associated with the federal bureaucracy. As we noted earlier, there are well over 2 million workers at the federal level, and not including the armed forces. In fact, we showed in a prior lecture that there are currently 2.9 million workers at the federal level. There are 14 executive departments and about 50 independent executive agencies. The policies range from foreign policy to treasury, to defense, to justice, to interior, agriculture, the environment, commerce, business, labor relations, and so forth and so on. These are massive administrative responsibilities, and of course, presidents alone could never even hope to be able to effectively manage the entire executive branch. They need help. Generally then, policy administration has a low priority with presidents. Why is that? Well, presidents have many obligations from foreign policy to legislative programs, policy development, and legislative activities. Presidents often feel they can accomplish more in international relations than domestically because they are constrained by Congress in domestic policies. Presidents are also quite active in performing ceremonial functions. As I noted earlier, typically in the afternoon, a president will, after having been advised in the morning on economics, domestic policy, and foreign policy, will turn their attention to ceremonial things such as greeting visitors, making speeches to interest groups, and so forth. Presidents are far more attuned to doing ceremonial functions than they are to attending to their role as chief executive. Presidents have little electoral incentive to engage in policy administration. They held only a short time in office, either 4 or 8 years, and their historical legacy may not be tied to policy administration. Their short time in office leads to a more short-term perspective. Presidents also know that they will get little credit for effective policy administration, though they will receive a lot of blame for implementation problems or scandals that arise from ineffective policy implementation. This stood out very clearly during the Reagan administration with the scandals at HUD, at the Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government. Okay, so as a result of these incentives, or I might call them disincentives, presidents devote little attention to policy administration. So, despite the president's clear responsibility for policy administration, they typically choose to engage in other activities. With respect to the bureaucracy and policy implementation, presidents are rarely in a position to command and expect those commands to be carried out without question. There are a number of problems of effective policy administration. There can be communications breakdowns between the chief executive and those in the executive departments, particularly once you get below the department head and deputy directors and so forth into the personnel where the tires meet the road. Officials may not actually know what the president wants, and so there may be communications breakdowns. The message that the president intends may not actually be transmitted from the White House. For example, the CIA and the Bay of Pigs invasion, they did not transmit Kennedy's directive that the invaders head for the hills if things went wrong with that, and as a result, the Cuban expatriates who participated in the Bay of Pigs invasion became quickly captured by the Cubans, and instead of conducting an insurgency from the hills, they became part of the prison system in Cuba. Another factor here is information distortion because of the layers that information has to go through from the top to the bottom. As the information passes through each layer toward the bottom, that information gets distorted. I'm sure some of you may have played the game at maybe a party where people line up and you whisper in the first person's ear, and then that person whispers in the next person's ear, and the message that comes out at the other end is typically quite different than the message that started with the first person. So this is an example of how information distortion can result in breakdown in communications. More decentralization leads to greater possibility of communications breakdowns. Okay, thirdly here, some presidents may not give unambiguous orders. For example, Nixon was noted for not being very clear about the orders he was giving, and as a result, policy implementation would break down due to communications missteps. Policy itself may be unclear. Policies that are promulgated by Congress can be complex. The bureaucracy can lack expertise and time by the formulators of the policy. There can be a difficulty of reaching consensus. Congress may pass the bureaucracy a political hot potato. That is, pass the buck to the bureaucracy and let them take the blame, is the idea here. Congress may promulgate a vague policy, and that vague policy may be a hindrance to effective implementation, or it may be a boon to effective implementation. The specific policy may be a hindrance to effective implementation, and we can take some anecdotes here. A specific policy guidance will promote effective implementation, such as occurred with the EPA in 1970. They gave the EPA a period of 90 days to promulgate a set of regulations that would help clean up the air, and EPA met that goal. And because it was under a specific policy guideline and a specific policy deadline, it was forced to meet that goal. Or it may be a hindrance to effective implementation. Congress was very unclear on what was to be done when it created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and this occurred in 1964. The policy itself that was promulgated was very unclear. They gave the EEOC a total first-year budget of $6 million, and it required far more than that, and far more personnel than that would enable in order to give the agency the ability to hit the road running. In fact, it took until 1972, with the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, for EEOC to become an effective agency. So you have a period of about 8 years when the EEOC was really not doing its job. You could argue even that because of the lack of clarity, EEOC is still not doing a very effective job. Congress could have put specific definitions on what constitutes inequality, and it could have defined discrimination, but it chose to not do that, to allow the EEOC to work under very unclear guidelines, and the result is and has been that it's not a very effective agency in stopping discrimination, either in the workplace or in housing or in the schools and so forth. Another idea here about passing the buck to the bureaucracy concerns the notion of capture. The capture theory suggests that without clear guidelines, agencies will be captured by those they are intended to affect. This is well known to have happened in the Civil Aeronautics Board, an agency that was abolished in the 1970s, and the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission was captured up until the 1980s. The vague mandate and EPA filled in the details was an example of a specific policy. Also, OSHA was very specific in its mandate, and it resulted in a myriad of minuscule regulations because of that specificity. And so the political hot potato idea is quite reasonable in terms of why Congress might be unclear in its policy that is handed over to the bureaucracy. Okay, policy may also be unclear because the president can give inconsistent signals as to the direction that they want policy to go in. Presidents can at one point say one thing, and another point they say another thing, and because of that, the agency heads and the agency itself is confused. Another reason why implementation can fail is due to insufficient or poorly directed resources. Few programs have all the resources that they need to be effective. Certainly, one example here is eliminating poverty. The Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for poverty programs, but it has far fewer resources that it would need in order to eliminate poverty. It has a food stamp program. It has a program for a general program for welfare support. It has significant personnel devoted to these functions, but it certainly doesn't have the resources that are needed to eliminate poverty. Resources, of course, include money and staff and authority and facilities and equipment. Sometimes the disposition of the implementers can be an impediment to effective implementation. Bureaucrats can be favorable or opposed to the direction that presidents want the policy to go in. For example, we could talk about Reagan and the EPA, the EEOC, and the Food and Drug Administration. These are three examples from my 1994 book on the dynamics of political control of the bureaucracy. Reagan wanted the EPA and the EEOC to diminish regulation. EPA was staffed by zealots, that is, tree huggers, people who really wanted environmental regulation to succeed. When Reagan attempted to depress implementation by the EPA, there were a lot of leaks to Congress and a lot of leaks to the public about what was going on at the EPA. And within about 18 months of Reagan's initial efforts, there had been a turnaround. The administrator of the EPA had been fired. She actually resigned, and new staff at the top were appointed by Reagan. And what we saw after about 1983 was an agency that was far more vigorous. Similarly, at the EEOC, we saw Reagan appoint someone who had actually stated that he would no longer be implementing equal employment opportunity laws. If you want to read the details of that, you can look at my book on the bureaucratics of dynamics, the dynamics of political control of the bureaucracy. But basically, his name was Michael Connolly. A similar thing happened here. Within a short time, Connolly was forced to resign because he was taking the EEOC in a direction that was not consistent with its legal mandate. Similar thing happened to the FDA, so I think I've made my point here. Staffing the bureaucracy. Appointments. Presidents nominate about 625 top administrative officials to the executive branch. He has about 3 months to think about who will fill these positions in the period between the election in November and the taking office in January. And he has to do this in competition with other pressures. Nominations serve multiple purposes. They are rewards for the president's fellow partisans. But presidents may be also interested in appointing those who have neutral competence. There are also pressures from interest groups in who to nominate to head various agencies. Political norms, such as senatorial courtesy, may be important here. Presidents typically know few of the people who are nominated and have to depend on others to assure that they're competent and consistent with the president's program. Partisanship is probably not a good guide in affecting the effectiveness of staffing the bureaucracy. Partisans don't make good appointees. Controlling policy administration. Political appointments are a major determinant of policy outputs from the bureaucracy. Again, I would point you to my early work on looking at the EPA and actually 7 different agencies. I examined statistically their policy outputs and showed pretty definitively that as political appointees come and go, we will see policy outputs change from the bureaucracy. Implicit in this idea is the notion that the appointees are managing resources and managing those under them in a manner that will either increase or decrease policy outputs from the bureaucracy. Less than 1% of the executive branch are appointed. Most of the rest of the bureaucracy fall under the rules of the service, the civil service. That is, they may not be removed except for cause. Furthermore, they're there for a lot longer than the appointees are there for. And so here we have tenured civil servants being directed by appointees who will serve typically no more than about 2 to 2.5 years. I actually have work on the duration of service of executive branch appointees, and their tenures is usually about 2 to 2.5 years. On the other hand, the civil service, which comprises 99% of the executive branch, cannot be removed. So there's a disincentive to obedience, if you will, to those who would move the bureaucracy in a direction that those in the civil service would not prefer. Is it good or bad that civil servants have tenure? It implies potential non-responsiveness to the president and other actors. And so from the standpoint of democratic theory, you could make an argument that it's bad. But on the other hand, it protects civil servants from inappropriate influences. Agencies have legal mandates, and civil servants know what those legal mandates are. And if the president's appointees attempt to move an agency in a direction that is inconsistent with the agency's legal mandate, then civil servants' non-responsiveness may well be consistent with the law. The Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 was passed during the Carter administration. It established an Office of Personnel Management, abbreviated OPM. The OPM is independent of the Executive Office of the President, and it assists in staffing the bureaucracy. It established a Merit System Protection Board to protect the rights of civil servants. it also established a tiered civil service, some of which serves at the pleasure of the president. Just as an aside here, if you want a job with the federal government, you will need to apply through the Office of Personnel Management. You will, in your application, be required to take an examination, a civil service examination, and the hiring and firing by OPM is governed by the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board, again, protects the rights of civil servants. So it prevents discrimination and other factors from being important. As I note here, some of the appointees, some of the civil servants serve at the pleasure of the president. There is a senior executive service, which is at the top of the bureaucratic hierarchy of career executives. These sit just below the president's appointees, and there are two types of SES appointees. These are the career reserved, where there is no need for impartial, there is a need for impartial service. And then there are the general SES, where there is a need for responsiveness to the presidency and to the administration. Career SES appointments are appointed with tenure and have protections against politically motivated actions and retaliation. Non-career SES appointments are by law restricted to more than 10% of all SES positions. These individuals can be removed by those appointing the position. There are also limited appointment SES positions that are reserved for positions where the position is not a continuing position, that is, for temporary positions. The remainder of the U.S. Civil Service has greater civil service protections, but also lower salaries and less important jobs. The Reagan administration and subsequent administrations reaped the benefits of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. There has been a trend toward politicizing the bureaucracy since that legislation. Below the SES are career personnel who cannot be removed except for cause. Changing the character of the bureaucracy is a very slow and secular process. Burt Rockman has published work on beliefs and more recently surveys showing the bureaucracy has actually become more conservative through time. Presidential use of incentives to control lower workers as possible under the Civil Service Reform legislation through the merit system. In other words, presidents can shift people around. Reagan, for example, sent civil servants from Washington to Montana and very remote locations in order to staff the Washington location with loyalists. Congress rarely allocates money for merit pay increases, though, and so presidents can't really use merit pay increases to affect lower workers, nor can the president reduce their pay. Bureaucratic structure can either facilitate or limit presidential control. Executive agencies versus independent agencies. Executive agencies tend to be more responsive. Independent agencies are much less responsive. The leadership style, whether that leadership style is a single executive in charge of the agency or a multiple-headed agency, such as exists at many of the independent agencies, or partisanship requirements. The leadership of some agencies is required to be based on partisanship, where no more than a certain number of the collegial leaders can be members of one political party. For example, the Federal Reserve, the requirement for nomination of the Federal Reserve is that there can be no more than half of the governors, Federal Reserve governors, being from one political party. the president also shares control over the bureaucracy with Congress. Standard operating procedures can create difficulty in controlling bureaucratic inertia, and standard operating procedures are difficult to reverse at times. An example here is the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Navy way of doing things. The Navy wanted to run a blockade. The Navy wanted to use ships, in other words, to combat the presence of of Russian missiles in Cuba. And it was difficult to convince them that there was another way to attack this crisis. And so Kennedy was thankfully able to do that. Independent agencies, some are more dependent of the executive branch than others. For example, EPA is in name an independent agency, but it has a single head, and the head is designated by the president by nomination and appointment. And so EPA is less independent than, say, the Federal Reserve, which has many features that imbue it with greater independence. Fragmentation is important here as well. Responsibility for implementation is often shared both horizontally among agencies and vertically within the federal system. Horizontally among agencies means that multiple agencies share the same task. For example, EPA and the Department of Energy share responsibility for regulation of the nuclear industry. Or vertically within the federal system, the Clean Air Act requires that the EPA share responsibility for clean air regulation and enforcement with states. Bureaucrats protect their turf, and this in turn further exacerbates difficulties arising from fragmentation. Fragmentation diffuses responsibility and promotes a lack of accountability and unclear chains of command. Fragmentation also promotes duplication and inefficiency. Presidents have often been delegated reorganization authority, and I noted earlier that they had that authority up to 1980. They haven't had that authority since 1980. However, opposition from congressional committees and interest groups have limited the president's efforts to regenerate rational administration. Rational administration meaning a structure that is both efficient and effective. Carter was relatively successful when he separated health, education, and welfare into two departments and made a plethora of other changes. Nixon and environmental programs. Nixon consolidated environmental programs under the umbrella of the EPA. And so he was effective in pursuing rational administration. In other presidencies, this has been more difficult because of the lack of the president's reorganization authority. Follow-up, presidents rarely evaluate policy to assure that effective implementation is occurring. Presidents and their staff are too busy with things like crisis management, electoral politics, foreign policy, or legislative programs. Moreover, presidents lack systematic information on policy implementation. Here's an idea, though, that was proposed by me and a co-author in earlier work, and the idea is called policy monitoring. With policy monitoring, agencies are forced, and we made this proposal back in the late 1980s. Under this proposal, agencies are required to publish data on their enforcement statistics. The idea here is that when they publish data on enforcement statistic, it puts them in a position that is far more visible, both to the public and more to what I had in mind, to scholars. Scholars would in turn use those published statistics to do studies of policy implementation. Interestingly, since the late 1980s, we've seen agencies publish more of their data online, we've also seen more scholarly research on, agency activities. There are a variety of tools that presidents use to control the bureaucracy. Presidents have often turned to what we might call an administrative presidency strategy when they are faced with a Congress that is not supportive of the policy direction that they prefer. Ronald Reagan explicitly used an administrative presidency strategy in the domain of regulation. He had run on a campaign of advocating deregulation of the environment, deregulation of worker safety, consumer protection, business and industry, and the list goes on and on and on of what he wanted to deregulate. His administrative presidency strategy relied on political appointments and executive orders. Clinton and George W. Bush also pursued an administrative presidency strategy. Through executive orders, they affected both abortion policy, healthcare policy, equality issues, and quite a number of things through their administrative presidency strategy. Executive Order 12-866 for Clinton, Executive Order 13-422 for Bush. There's also a January 20th of 2009 memorandum by Obama sent to the heads of executive departments and agencies, and he issued Executive Order 13-497. Presidents use the following when pursuing an administrative presidency strategy. They appoint officials to head agencies that will affect policy and outputs in the direction they prefer. They will shift personnel in a manner that puts the most zealous or the most opposing personnel in their preferred positions. They will issue executive orders when they face a hostile Congress and can't get legislation. They use budgeting to set spending priorities at these agencies. They can also internally to an agency reorganize that agency. Note this has nothing to do with reorganization of the executive branch. They have authority to reorganize the internals of an executive agency. So thinking about this administrative presidency strategy, all of that looks really, really familiar from the standpoint of the current president. The current president has done all of these things. He's shifted political appointees that affect policy in a direction that he wants. He's shifted personnel around. He's used executive orders. He has set spending priorities with budgeting, and he has reorganized agencies. So the current president is also using an administrative presidency strategy. Regulation, presidents and the bureaucracy. Presidents of both political parties tend to have very distinctive views on regulation. Democrats generally view regulation as a way to protect the nation. Republicans generally view regulation as an impediment to business. Either way, regulation is the most controversial aspect of presidential relationships with the bureaucracy. According to Wikipedia, there are more than 30,000 laws in the United States Code. These have been accumulating since 1789. So Congress and the president have enacted 30,000 laws in the history of the nation. According to the Congressional Research Service, 201,806 final rules had been published in the Federal Register between 1976 and 2018. So, as you can see by numbers here, regulation is far more pervasive. And I would go so far as to say it is far more important to the daily lives of Americans. Regulation is a result of a science and technology-based decision-making process that incorporates elements of democracies, as we'll show in a little while. However, regulation is formulated, that is, it is legislated, executed, and judged by federal regulatory bureaucracies. Congress delegates policy-making authority to the bureaucracy by authorizing rulemaking. Rules promulgated by federal agencies have the force of law, except to the extent they conflict with law and the Constitution. Let me emphasize here. Rules that are promulgated by regulatory agencies have the same effect as law, except to the extent that they conflict with law and the Constitution. This means that regulatory bureaucracies are effectively lawmakers. However, the regulatory process is bounded by a set of rules. That set of rules was established by the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. I have a hot link there to the APA so that you can, if you want to, you can go there and look at what the process is. The Administrative Procedure Act lays out how rulemaking is to be done, including requirements for notification of proposed rules, public comment periods, and publication of final rules. In order to promulgate a rule under the APA, federal agencies need to publish a notification of proposed rule in a document set called the Federal Register. What is the Federal Register? The Federal Register is a record of the daily activities of the federal government. The Federal Register, since 1946, has recorded the daily activities of the federal government that is required by the APA to be recorded. The notification of proposed rule must be published in the Federal Register if there is to be a rule promulgated. So let's go to the link here on the notification of proposed rulemaking. Okay, so you can see that, that Wikipedia has a nice entry here on this. A notice of proposed rulemaking is a public notice that is issued by law when an independent agency of the U.S. government wishes to add, remove, or change a rule or regulation as part of the rulemaking process. This notice is an important part of the U.S. administrative law, which facilitates government by typically creating a process of taking a public comment. The term is also used at the state level in the United States. So similar processes occur at the state level. Following notification of proposed rule in the Federal Register, a period of public comment follows that notification. This period of public comment is typically 60 days. However, depending on what is contained in the notification of proposed rule, that period may be longer, or rarely it's going to be shorter than 60 days, but it may be longer than 60 days. Once the comment period is over, that is, once the public has completed its comments on the proposed rule, the agency will then consider the public comments as well as the expertise from those inside the bureaucracy. Following a decision to finalize a rule, the completed rule is first published in the Federal Register and then subsequently published in the Code of Federal Regulations. What is the Code of Federal Regulations? The Code of Federal Regulations is a compendium of all federal regulations that are in existence, and the codification categorizes these by grouping. Let's go back to Wikipedia on that. I just read the first paragraph here. The Code of Federal Regulations is the codification of the general and permanent rules and regulations published in the Federal Register by the executive departments and agencies of the federal government of the United States. the CFR is divided into 50 titles that represent broad areas subject to federal regulation. So the idea here is that with regard to regulations, with the Code of Federal Regulations, we have an analog to the U.S. Code. The U.S. Code is a codification of all laws that have been passed by the United States Congress and the President, whereas the Code of Federal Regulations is a codification of all of the regulations that have been promulgated. The entire rulemaking process is described at a link that I have put in this bullet, and I'll let you go there on your own for that. Once a rule is finalized, it is then executed. That is, it is enforced by the federal rulemaking bureaucracy. In most cases, the agency has a workforce of inspectors or auditors who will evaluate whether the regulated entity is complying with the rule. This may be a company or individuals. For example, the banking industry is subject to rulemaking by actually 4 different agencies. The most important of which, of course, is going to be the Federal Reserve. But in any case, there are auditors who will go into the banks and they will audit the bank's books and determine whether they are in compliance with the regulations associated with the banking industry. Other examples, EPA regulates clean air, clean water, hazardous waste, and so forth. And so EPA has a workforce of inspectors who will go out and they will evaluate whether or not the regulated entity, that is a company, is complying with EPA rules on the amount of air pollution or water pollution or hazardous waste pollution that is put into the environment. So there are inspectors and auditors who will evaluate what's going on in the area being regulated. If an entity, company, or individuals are found in violation of a federal rule, then a notice of violation is typically issued by the regulating entity. This term, notice of violation, is commonly used, though the title of that violation may vary across agencies. So this is like an accusation or a charge being made toward a regulated entity. The accused is then given a period of time to respond and or alter their behavior to move into compliance. The regulated entity can challenge the finding in an administrative law court, or the regulated entity can respond to the notice of violation by informing the regulating authority of how it has altered its behavior. So they can either comply or they can choose to fight the accusation about their behavior. If the regulated entity challenges the finding or refuses to alter its behavior, then a case is heard before an administrative law judge. The arguments in the administrative law court are made by specialists in administrative law. These are lawyers who specialize in administrative law. Administrative law judges are both adjudicators and triers of fact, unlike judges in the civilian court system where there are juries. So if you go to court in the civil or criminal courts in the United States, your verdict will typically be, your arguments will typically be heard by a jury. In contrast, in administrative law court, the administrative law judge holds a bench trial. That is, they are both jury and adjudicators. if the administrative law court finds that the regulated entity is indeed not in compliance with the regulation, then civil penalties can be levied. These penalties can range from fines to seizure of assets to actually shutting down the business. For example, in my study earlier in my career of nuclear regulatory fines, the NRC levied fines of $500,000 a day on entities, nuclear plants that were found to be in violation of certain regulations. $500,000 a day. Imagine how quickly that can be built up. And so there's a real incentive to clean up their act in the nuclear industry. Assets, as I said, can be seized, or the company or entity can actually be shut down and put out of business. So from here, the regulated entity can challenge the finding of the administrative law court in federal court. However, there is an established norm that a federal civil court will not overturn an administrative law court unless there has been an error relating to law or the Constitution. The federal courts will not adjudicate substantive content of administrative law court rulings. In other words, the bench trial has to be consistent with the law and the Constitution. The substantive findings of the bench trial are not subject to review by the civil courts. So as a result of this, the regulated entity will rarely succeed beyond this point. Again, it's really rare that the regulated entity will get the administrative law court decision overturned. Final rules have the force of law to the extent they do not contradict the law or the Constitution. Again, final rules have the force of law if they don't contradict existing law or the Constitution. Congress may overturn a rule by passing a new law and getting the president's signature. However, presidents may not overturn a rule by executive order or other means. Presidents may not overturn a rule by executive order or other means. In order for presidents to overturn a rule, which has the force of law, they have to initiate a new rulemaking process that complies with the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. So presidents, to overturn a rule, have to go through the same process that was employed in promulgating the rule in the first place. In other words, they have to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. They have to allow a period of public comment after that. And then once the public comment period is over, then they can publish a final rule in the Federal Register. This process, though, as you can see, will take some time and is also subject to court challenges based on the procedures that are used to overturn the rule and the substance. So rulemaking then constrains presidential authority. Rulemaking constrains presidential authority. Presidents can, however, affect the rulemaking process in several ways. They can affect the number of rules being promulgated by issuing executive orders, such as Reagan's Executive Order 12291, which we talked about earlier, and similar executive orders such as were issued by presidents subsequent to Ronald Reagan. Presidents can affect the substance and significance of rules being promulgated through the political appointment process. Presidents can affect the substance and significance of rules being promulgated by signaling their policy priorities to the regulatory agency. But administrative law judges are appointed without Senate confirmation by the heads of agencies, but presidents appoint those heads. Administrative law judges are tenured for life during good behavior and have a number of guarantees that they will be independent. So presidents cannot affect administrative law judges directly. Once they are there, they are tenured for life, but presidents don't appoint the administrative law judges. Rather, they're appointed without Senate confirmation by the heads of agencies. Of course, the heads of agencies are appointed by presidents. So presidents do have a way of affecting the new set of administrative law judges, but they cannot affect the existing set of administrative law judges. They have elements of their roles that make them independent. Okay, so in conclusion here, there are a number of themes that are prevalent in understanding the president's relationship with the bureaucracy. Is the bureaucracy responsive? To whom is the bureaucracy responsive? Is it responsive to the president, to the public, or Congress? Note that there are elements of democracy associated with bureaucratic responsiveness. A bureaucracy that is unresponsive to any of those actors could be argued to be undemocratic. Should the bureaucracy be responsive? And if so, to whom? A good argument can be made that the bureaucracy should not be responsive. Why? Because bureaucracies represent the law, not the public. They represent the law, just as the courts do. When Congress, in a prior period, say 20 years ago, produces a law that creates a bureaucracy and creates a regulatory process in a bureaucracy, that regulatory process and that bureaucracy is given a legal mandate. They are obligated to follow that legal mandate. Hence, the argument that bureaucracy is responsive to the law, not to the president, not to the public, and not to Congress. So should it be responsive? I've just argued that it shouldn't be. On the other hand, if you believe strongly in democracy and flipping and flopping around every time there is a new president or a new Congress, then you would believe, of course, that the bureaucracy should be responsive. Can we conceive of the bureaucracy as a representative institution? Think of the notion of active versus passive representation. Active representation would be involving the bureaucracy responding to the presidency and to the Congress in current time. Passive representation would refer to the idea that the components of the bureaucracy, the people who occupy the bureaucracy, are reflective of the overall population. And so passive representation is a different matter than active representation. Is the bureaucracy a monopoly, insensitive to market forces as conceived by economists, or do bureaucracies adjust to public feedback? Finally, how might the bureaucracy be made more responsive to mass public preferences? And concerning the earlier argument that I made, should it be responsive to mass public preferences? A good argument could be made in both directions, that it should and it shouldn't be more responsive to mass public preferences. There is a trade-off between responsiveness, efficiency, and equity. Equal treatment of citizens may mean less bureaucratic efficiency. And I showed this in an article published on the Internal Revenue Service pertaining to audits by the IRS. And what I did was I looked at the trade-off that exists between equal treatment and efficiency in audits in the Internal Revenue Service. And it was easy to show mathematically in that article that when you treat citizens equally, the IRS will in turn receive less audit money. And so there's a trade-off then between efficiency and equal treatment of citizens. Greater responsiveness may also diminish efficiency and equal treatment as groups seek favor. Okay, as you can see, once again, we have reached the conclusion of our lecture on the president and the bureaucracy. In this lecture, we started with a discussion of the formal powers that the president has with regard to the bureaucracy to take care that the laws be faithfully executed and so forth. We then talked about the president's role with regard to the federal bureaucracy and what presidents should be doing with regard to the federal bureaucracy. We also talked a little bit about what presidents have done with regard to the federal bureaucracy. We talked at length about federal regulation as occurs through the bureaucracy. And finally, we concluded here with some research questions, some questions in democratic theory and in bureaucratic theory that would pertain to research on the federal bureaucracy. We conclude then this lecture on the bureaucracy. We have one remaining lecture in this series, and that is the lecture on the president and the courts. And we will stop here and resume next time with that lecture. I hope you have a happy and healthy and productive next several days. Goodbye.